is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
World leaders recently concluded a two-day virtual leaders summit on climate, convened by U.S. President Joe Biden. The summit saw up to 40 world leaders attend, including Chinese President Xi Jinping. The meetings are seen as the return to a global multilateral approach to tackling climate change, coming in the aftermath of the U.S.'s exit from the Paris Climate Accord during the Trump administration. The biggest news out of the virtual event was commitments made to cut carbon emissions, with the U.S. promising to halve its air pollution by 2030 as China pledged to reduce coal consumption and become completely carbon-free by 2060. Britain and the European Union also made significant pledges. However, are the new goals big enough to adequately address the current climate crisis affecting the most vulnerable in the world? And will commitments made at the Virtual Leaders Summit result in dedicated action? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. America is back to lead the fight against climate change. That was the Earth Day's message from U.S. President Joe Biden. The declaration is seen as a move by the United States to repair its global image and coincides with President Biden marking his first 100 days in office. CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King has more.
After 4 years of reversing U.S. commitments on climate change, the White House is hoping that this two-day summit will help the United States reclaim leadership on the environment. U.S. President Joe Biden doesn't just have to convince the world that the U.S. is serious again, but also Americans who are skeptical that climate change is real. This presents a challenge and an opportunity to invest in the future.
The signs are unmistakable. The science is undeniable. But the cost of inaction keeps mounting. The United States isn't waiting. We are resolving to take action. Not only our federal government, but our cities and our states all across our country. Small businesses, large corporations, American workers in every field.
As expected, Washington promised to reduce carbon levels by 50 to 52% at 2005 levels by 2030. That's a big jump in commitments. And the news came after intense climate diplomacy by U.S. Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. His meetings in Shanghai with his Chinese counterparts have once again put China and the U.S. on the same path regarding climate. Japan also promised deeper cuts, but many nations repackaged previous unambitious targets. India and Australia are just two nations that experts say need to do much more. Europe is by far the most ambitious regional grouping when it comes to climate and have led the Western world during the recent US absence on the issue. But the EU says they need the US and others to do their part too.
Europe wants to be the first climate neutral continent in the world, but to save the climate, we need the world. We need all major economies to take their responsibility and to turn the transition into an opportunity for all.
National competition when it comes to climate change is actually a good thing, harnessing the power of nationalism to solve one of the globe's biggest problems. But there are other problems too. Poorer countries don't want to pay for what developed countries essentially polluted around the world. And the US population is extremely skeptical and, as we know, politically fickle when it comes to the issue of climate change. It's good to have the US back in the game, but the game is far from won. Nathan King, CGTN at the White House.
And now let's bring in our panel. Joining us in Johannesburg, J. Brooks Spector, Associate Editor at the Daily Maverick newspaper. In Washington, D.C., Professor John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. And in Oxford via Zoom, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, Professor of Global Environmental and Climate Governance. A warm welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us on this discussion. J. Brooks Spector, let me get your views first on this. After 4 years of climate policy decline under President Trump, President Joe Biden has begun re-engaging with world leaders and making pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the U.S. has re-entered the Paris Climate Agreement and is rerouting its economy to be powered by wind, solar, nuclear, and other renewables. Now, President Biden also recently convened a virtual climate summit. Now, tell us, how important are these developments in the wake of the current climate crisis?
Well, it's a very important question. In fact, perhaps it's the central question for the Biden administration in international affairs. You're quite right. When the Biden administration first began, one of the very first acts was to reassociate the United States with the Paris Climate Accord. This is not cosmetic. This is a statement of policy. One of the things that the Biden administration also said to its own government was that all governments in their planning and in their management would begin to prioritize climate change issues within their own structures, within their own institutions. And the movement toward the virtual climate summit for world leaders was I'm going to use the word concrete, even though it was virtual. It was a concrete manifestation of this re-emphasis on global climate concerns. The announcement that the U.S. would lower its carbon emissions by, I think the number that was ultimately given was 52% by the year 2035. That's aspirational, of course, because the government can't force businesses to do it. But as it begins to set standards and as it begins to implement policies and change the tax structure, bit by bit, corporations and individuals move very quickly in that direction. And in fact, some people argue that it is already cheaper to have new power plants run by solar or other renewable energy than it is to operate, say, a more traditional fossil fuel plant. So the motion is there, the aspirations, the goals are there. The reality of it, of course, is going to be a little bumpier.
Let's look at that reality, Professor Okereke, because this is a concrete manifestation of a re-emphasis on global climate crisis. Just how significant do you think that this climate summit was?
Well, I agree with J. Brooke that it is very significant. It is significant at least on 3 different levels. Number one, the fact that Biden has led the U.S. back into the Paris Agreement, and now that there is a sort of increase or ratcheting up of the U.S.'s own commitment. You know that the IPCC has suggested that the global emissions need to fall by about 45% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels, so that we can stay on the path of 1.5 degrees. And if you do the maths in terms of what the US have committed, you can see that it meets that level of ambition. But it's also significant on another level, which is equally crucial. And this is what we are calling the catalytic level. The US is a big player economically, but also diplomatically. And so we are hoping that the Biden administration will bring pressure to bear, as you've already seen as part of the summit, on other countries to also increase their ambition. So it is significant on the domestic, but also on the international level.
Right. Professor Gong, let me bring you in at this point, because first there were 2 important issues to note at the climate summit. And Professor Okereke has pointed out the diplomatic aspect of the United States at this stage. U.S. President Biden convened this just before he marked his 100 days in office. Chinese President Xi Jinping accepted that invitation. Break it down for us in terms of timing and significance and the global impact of these gestures.
The climate issue is one of the few areas that President Biden has said that this is a room for cooperation between the two great powers. And prior to that, his climate ambassador John Kerry actually went to Shanghai to have a detailed discussion with his counterpart in China. And there was some speculation that whether President Xi will attend that summit, but I think fortunately he did. Basically, he reiterated China's previously committed goals of peak the emission by actually before. Now I think it's before 2030, and try to be carbon neutral by 2060. Now, I think this is actually a great challenge because you look at the chart of the carbon emission over the years. I think at this point China is still going up. And this is actually not surprising because China being the manufacturing center in the world, it's kind of quite a challenge to bring emission down. But I think one thing we have learned in the past is that when Chinese government is committed to doing something, right, typically it will keep its promise because it can mobilize resources, it can organize things sort of as a whole of a nation approach to do that. So I'm quite confident that eventually we will achieve that goal. Particularly because of the fact that bulk of the reduction will be coming from the electricity generation industry. And there are many still coal-powered power plants in China right now. And I think the Chinese government is determined to replace all of these things with solar power, hydropower, and other possible technologies. Right now, it's about 60% of the electricity is coming from coal. We have already brought it down from like almost 80% to some 60% right now. I think this trend is still going to continue.
Right. Professor Okere, can we come back to the whole question of the pledges? Because as Professor Gong has mentioned, China said it would phase down its coal consumption from about 2025. But the US as well pledged to cut emissions by about 20 to 25% by 2030. Britain and the EU made some big pledges. Are these pledges sufficient, though, given the scale of the climate crisis?
So, in total, no, for now. The challenge is also that the near-term pledges do not quite match the long-term pledges. So this is not a situation where you can wait and then come in the very last minute and try and do something. We need to see the kind of the mid-term pledges significantly ratcheted up to match with the longer-term pledges. So you can promise, for example, that you're going to be carbon neutral by 2060, but if you don't have a very ambitious pledge for 2025, 2030-ish, 2040, then it is unlikely that in the last 20 years or 15 years, you suddenly come up with a magic that will make everything happen. But also, significantly, we need more pledges from the industrializing or rapidly industrializing countries. The second challenge we're seeing is that there is not yet enough attention on growing countries like Nigeria and India, and South Africa, to help these countries to stay on the path of low carbon development, given that these are some of the places where the emissions are likely to rise the most in the coming decades. And don't forget that these are still pledges, and there is likelihood that there could be a mismatch, a gap between the actual pledges and the implementation of the pledges.
Professor Gong, the impact of the cutting down on emissions and the impact of probably moving to other renewables for the job industry, that has to be weighed in against how climate change is really affecting the global economy.
Yeah, well, I think the job issue is a real issue, and I've heard some stories about the miners in West Virginia, for example, you've been working entirely on that industry, and I think the idea of transforming these people into other areas, it may not be very realistic, to be honest with you. I think these people are getting into their 40s and 50 years old, and you try to educate these people and orient these people to something entirely new will be a tall order. So I think this is where the government needs to step in and provide the kind of a social security network to support these people. I think these issues will be sort of addressed in a structural way. Once the policies kick in, once the industry is moving towards another direction, the job market is going to respond, although with some delay maybe. But I think in addition to the job issue, there's actually a more important issue here. Even though the power, the solar power cost has been coming down, but if you talk to the people, especially I think in many African countries, it's more than just about the cost of these solar panels. And the solar panel costs have been coming down dramatically, and I think it's mostly due to the fierce competition, particularly in China. I'll give you one example. The power cost. I mean, the solar panel cost on a per watt basis used to be in the $100 in the 1970s. Now it's come down to 20 cents, 20 US cents, dollar cents right now due to the competition it's mostly in China, I think. But the issue is more than about these costs. I know in Africa, for example, the electric grid, whether it's able to accommodate that kind of electricity source, right? Many countries it cannot. So you need to put a lot of money in upgrading the grid itself. You need energy storage. Well, there's a tons of innovation, research going on right now in China and US and also in Europe about bringing the cost down about these energy storage equipment. All these things are quite expensive actually. So I think the cost number is still not there, and that's why we're going to talk about this. We need these $100 billion from industrialized countries, from developed countries, to help countries like in Africa to pick up the tab, to make up the cost difference there.
All right. On that note, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll have more on the Leaders Summit on climate. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our discussion. Still with me from Johannesburg, J. Brooks Spector. In Washington, D.C., Professor John Gong. And joining us from Oxford via Zoom, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke. Thank you all for staying with us. So J. Brooks Spector, let's look at that huge disparity in carbon profile and its actual impact on either developing countries or countries in Africa for that matter, because the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has asked governments around the world to declare a state of climate emergency until the world has reached a net zero carbon emissions. So we are asking here, what is the actual state of that crisis to warrant a state of climate emergency? Because as we speak, there are about 38 countries which are already in a climate emergency.
Well, I mean, I personally, I don't take a whole lot of stock in grand gestures that say planetary climate emergency, because that's a very big phrase that doesn't talk to the specifics of what each individual person or country or region within a country is supposed to handle. Let me give you an example. I live in Africa, I live in South Africa, and although South Africa gets, by most calculations, about 354 days a year of bright sunlight, which you would think is perfect for solar renewable energy. I mean, there aren't too many other days left in the year where you wouldn't get it. One of the biggest impediments to the broad, wide-ranging, thorough adoption of solar power technology is the government's insistence that power distribution must remain in the hands of a single government corporation, Eskom, rather than allowing individuals or individual communities or individual large companies to set up their own generating capabilities through solar power and distribute their own energy. Those are the kinds of initiatives that answer some of the questions that my co-panelists are already mentioning, and that it allows individuals to get innovative with their own technologies or other technologies. It encourages more production within a country of technologies that are appropriate for this, and it lowers the cost per unit of energy consumed. And things like that, we often tend to forget that it sometimes is government regulations or the type of government regulations that preclude innovation and that prevent increases in efficiency. It's not as if people don't realize the crisis in this part of the world. I saw a presentation not so very long ago which talked to what is going to happen to food security in southern Africa if the mean temperature rises above a certain point. Whole zones of the country that are now agriculturally productive will move either into marginal agricultural production or no agricultural production simply by virtue of the changes in temperature and the resulting changes in the rainfall and the type of rainfall and when. And so this is something that we also don't think enough about, the way the actual human ecology has to shift if we don't solve some of these problems with a degree of alacrity that the broad global climate emergency doesn't necessarily really address down here at the, if you'll pardon the phrase, the coal face.
All right. Professor Okereke, I want to get your thoughts on that, particularly at this point when we are seeing major changes with moving on to other greener technologies, particularly looking at what the United States is doing by rerouting its economy.
Yes, it is important, as Jebrook and John have indicated, to be clear that the transition is arranged and managed in such a way that we provide jobs for those that are going to be losing their job in the coal and oil industry. However, if Africa imports all of its solar panels from, say, China, the job translation that I gave you will not eventuate, and that will mean even more poverty for African countries, especially in the context of the fact that they will not be mining or expected to mine their oil from the ground. And that then leads you to another challenge, which is a bigger structural macroeconomic challenge associated with stranded assets. So we need to be sure, from African perspective, that this transition is carefully managed so that Africa doesn't end up losing jobs and losing economic competitiveness.
So, Professor Okereke, I want to come back to, as we look at where Africa is and what Africa is grappling with, because it is a very low emitter at this point. Give us some practical examples of how climate change is actually affecting the global economy and how it is literally trickling down to low emitters like countries in Africa.
Well, that's a very good question. So we've already talked about the fact that Africa is a low emitter and yet bears the greatest brunt of the impact of climate change. And to just paint a picture, the emission that it takes 2.5 days of emission of somebody in US will require 1 year for that kind of emission to be produced by an average person in Chad or Niger or Mali. So that gives you a sense of the huge disparity in the emission profile of average Canadian or US citizen and an average African. And yet, the brunt is being borne mostly by people in Africa. But this now means that African countries, especially those that are dependent on oil, are finding it much harder to attract investment in their oil. And yet, they do not have the alternative green renewable technologies to rely on. This means that it could be worse economically for Africa if the they do not attract, as John was saying, the sort of international funding that is required for them to really make this transition to the greener future.
As we wind up the program, I want to give you all a final moment to comment, make your final comments. And as you do that, let's look at the road to COP26 in Glasgow. And I'm sure everyone has thoughts on what issues should be dominating COP26. I'll start off with you, Professor Gong in Washington, D.C. What are the issues that you think should be at the forefront in COP26?
Now, I also want to come back to this issue raised by other panelists about the solar panels being manufactured in China. This is actually not quite correct. I mean, even though the Chinese companies hold a very large share of the worldwide solar power panel market, the Chinese countries being setting up manufacturing facilities all over the world in developing countries. Second, I think about this funding issue, $100 billion, why it is insured. I think a large part of it is because of Donald Trump. He cut back, billions. I think like something like $3 billion of funding for this purpose. And I hope that the Biden administration would at least pick up the tab for the last 4 years and hopefully increase its pledge as we going forward for the next summit. The funding for Africa. So I think as long as the industrialized countries, they put their acts together, there's going to hope.
Professor Okere, your thoughts on what you think, what issues you think Africa should be taking to COP26?
Africa needs to hold the rest of the world to their pledges and encourage the rest of the world to ratchet up their pledges, because we are bearing the greatest impact of climate change. Number two, there has to be significant movement, obviously, on finance to enable African and other developing countries like the small island states to take action. There must be a rapid increase in contribution of public finance to enable action on climate change. And number three, there has to be a greater emphasis on adaptation. Yes, mitigation tends to occupy the center stage most of the time for some obvious reasons, but really we have to be paying enough attention as well to adaptation. And by the way, we need to increase conversation around loss and damage. It is not the case. It is not right. It is not fair. It is not consistent with the spirit of justice and equity to not talk about how to compensate Africa and the rest of the developing countries for the extensive damage that they are incurring as a result of climate change, especially when they have not contributed to causing this problem. And let me just finish up by, again, pushing back on what John was saying. The truth remains that the bulk of the solar panels that are being used in Africa today are imported from China. I think John needs to check his facts. It is not the case that there are not some manufacturing plants here and there, but the bulk is still coming from, and if it continues like that, I don't think that Africans will be the better for it in terms of translating the green economy into economic growth and jobs.
All right, and we are going to leave it there for the moment. Thank you all for your contribution to this important discussion on climate change and the climate crisis. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts in Johannesburg, J. Brooks Spector, Associate Editor at the Daily Maverick newspaper. In Washington, D.C., Professor John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. And in Oxford via Zoom, Professor Chukwumerije Okereke, Professor of Global Environmental and Climate Governance. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Until next week, goodbye.